Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Weeb Union, and in this one we start out in the Robotina section of the front line where the Russians have made an advance northwest of the town. This happens after the Russians have consolidated their gains within the town and have now moved upwards in a northern direction, reaching the forest line here that is connected to the area in which the Russians have advanced to. So with an advance along the main highway, they've advanced into the forest line here that goes through to the northern pass, and combining that with an assault from the western direction, they've managed to attack it and advance in that direction. This has aligned the front line along this forest line, which gives a strong flank to the Russian positions within Robotina and allows the Russians to start and develop an offensive operation north of Robotina. The Ukrainian positions along the highway are located here along the forest lines, where we see these fortified positions to the south of the forest line. Further north, we see that there are additional defensive positions along the forest lines and along the highway. The highway is well fortified all the way from Robotina to Decisive, and there are several fortified positions east of Robotina that have yet to fall under Russian hands. Therefore, we will likely see continuous fighting over the fortified positions over the next few weeks or even months. We see that the advance here by the Russians was geolocated with this footage here, confirming the Russian advance is along the forest line. In the next section of the front line here in the direction of Krasnohorivka, there's been a small advance by the Russians, capturing a few more buildings to expand their foothold here in the eastern parts of Krasnohorivka. We see that with this recent geolocated footage. We see continuous footage along this section of the front line of heavy fighting, always reaching the outskirts of the town, but we do not really see any significant presence within the town. This leads to one or of two things. Either the Russians have yet to gain a proper foothold, or their foothold is simply at the outskirts due to the heavy fire of the Ukrainians, making it difficult to consolidate these gains within the outskirts of the town to then develop the offensive operations further. We're currently seeing some positional fighting along the first buildings, and this is under heavy Ukrainian fire from both artillery and FPV drones. The buildings on the outskirts of Krasnohorivka are mostly destroyed. This makes it difficult for Russian soldiers to occupy these first buildings. This means that they have to go deeper before they can actually establish a position within the town. Further north, to the north of these positions, the Russians have advanced from Pobieda and down along the road. They have managed to reach a position where they can start fighting over the Ukrainian fortified positions north of Krasnohorivka. As expected, they're going to launch multiple operations in the northern flank of Krasnohorivka now that heavy fighting is taking place in the southern flank. This is due to the fact that although there is this river line separating the central parts of the town with the Dutch area to the north and the fortified areas to the north, this also means that the main presence of Ukrainian soldiers are within the town and the fortified positions, which points towards the Russians wanting to make this into a two-front war for the Ukrainians, with them attacking both Krasnohorivka and the fortified positions. And if they manage to gain control of either of those, they'll be able to support the other section. The reason for this is that the Ukrainians have limited artillery and heavy drones that they can use. The wider the front is, the less concentration of forces there would be on the Russian side. It would be the same for the Ukrainian side, but with the superiority in firepower for the Russians to be able to hit more targets. Therefore, the Russians have an interest in expanding the front line, and that is why we see both assaults to the north and to the south in the direction of Krasnohorivka and the fortified positions. We'll also likely see battles starting over the fortified positions northwest of Pobieda soon, as the Russians would look to gain control over this entirety section of the front line north of Krasnohorivka, these three lines of defense. This will also allow the Russians to not just pressure Krasnohorivka from the north, but also Antonivka and along this road and village chain here west of Krasnohorivka. Also allow the Russians to secure the southern flank of Maximilianivka and Hryhorivka to advance in the direction of Kurakhove. So we see several reasons for the Russians to continue and expand the front line here in the north. In the direction of Krasnohorivka, the Russians have managed to capture the northwestern outskirts of the city and now are moving on to the areas outside of the city but are still part of the city. They have both managed to cross the Losova River into the northern section of the residential area, and they also started fighting in the western section of the residential area. So we see that the area is split into these two parts, the northern parts north of Krasnohorivka and the western parts west of the city. Both of these locations are being fought over right now as Russians have started operations in both of these directions. According to the latest reports, the Russians have also managed to regain their positions in the southwest of Krasnohorivka, but again, I'll just change the front line, the mapping, as soon as it is solid. I don't want to keep editing it every day, as it would continue changing hands. I'm waiting until there is a definitive change. So we see heavy fighting in the northwestern parts of Krasnohorivka and some positional fighting in the southwest of Krasnohorivka, where the Russians are here looking to gain full control over the city. It will likely also encompass an assault coming from the east to strengthen their positions and attack on two parts, both in the central and eastern parts. The objective here in the central parts would be to cut off the road, gain control of that, would allow the Russians to gain control over the eastern parts, and then move on to the western parts. Gain control over the western parts will also allow the Russians to then move down into the southwestern parts and attack from two directions yet again. You can also start a flanking maneuver from the open fields to the southwest, here west of Krasnohorivka, which would be a three-pronged attack from the east, south, and north at the same time. Further north here in the direction of the Avdiivka section of the front line, which is now the Pokrovsk section of the front line. As we see here, the outskirts of the map is now further away from Avdiivka than Pokrovsk, and we see that the Russian forces have managed to attack in the direction of the fortified positions north of Shelane, where positional fighting is taking place. The Ukrainians want to avoid the Russians taking control of the fortified positions and a foothold in Shelane, and the objective is exactly that. We see that if the Russians manage to capture these fortified positions, they'll be able to flank all of the Ukrainian fortified positions along the river line, and this will significantly improve the Russian positions in the area. Also, gaining control over Shelane will allow the Russians to push further onwards along the railways to Mykolaiivka and the next line of defense of the Ukrainians, bypassing the Ukrainian fortified positions by Serhivka and Vesele and so on in the northern direction towards Hrodivka. The next part would be Hrodivka, and the Russians are speeding through terrain to reach that as fast as possible before the Ukrainians reestablish their next lines of defense, because the Ukrainians simply do not have that much defense and depth manpower left. This is why we see the Russians attempting to go beyond the Ukrainian positions and flank them completely. The Russians also managed to capture the rest of the fortified positions north of Pokrovsk in the direction of Ivanivka, fighting reaching the outskirts of the town both from the south and from the east. Further north, the Russians gained a foothold in Timofivka and captured the rest of the fortified positions here as well, as they advanced along their main road and the southern flank of Vostyshenka. The fighting here in the Pokrovsk section of the front line is incomparable to what we have seen much of this war, and that's because if we look at the current fighting in a simple manner, we can say that the Russians have a concentration of forces in Robotina, of which they send forces to different sections of the front line, usually in small groups of between squad-sized units and company-sized units, so at most 100 soldiers. Now, what we're currently seeing here in the fighting west of Pokrovsk is multiple companies-sized, battalion-sized units fighting at the front. In a similar manner, the Ukrainians have fortified positions, defensive positions like Hrodivka, and Pokrovsk, where they, in a similar manner, have squad-sized, company-sized, and other sized units across the front. And now, due to the fact that the Russians have broken through, let's say they had a company-sized unit in Pokrovsk, they would have a battalion-sized in the villages in the rear. This is to be able to redirect their forces to where it is needed to plug the gap. Therefore, the fighting has now gone through the company-sized units and is now fighting the battalion-sized units across the front. This means that there is a larger concentration of Ukrainian forces in these villages than there were previously, due to the fact that they are now fighting in the rear and not the front. And this means that the Ukrainians would also take more casualties. Similarly, the Russians will take more casualties. But due to the large concentration of forces, the firepower will be much more effective. Therefore, the rate at which the fighting is taking place has increased significantly, and the amount of casualties taken has increased significantly. This means that this considerably speeds up the fighting in the area. The Russians have not slowed down at all, and that is because this offensive operation is an actual offensive by the Russians, where they are pushing as far as they can go towards Pokrovsk to enter a new stage in the Battle of the Donetsk region. And this is why I titled one of my videos "The Beginning of the End of the War in Ukraine," because if the objective of the Russians is simply to capture the Donetsk region, well, this is the battle that starts it all, and it is the battle that could end it all. Further north in the Toretsk section of the front line, we see further fighting by the Russians and further advances by the Russians, both in the northern and southern part of the second line of defense of the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians have their second line of defense, and the front line is now almost entirely aligned with the second line of defense. This shows that the Russian advances along the first line of defense have been devastating, and now the Ukrainians are struggling to hold on to the second line of defense, or the area between the first and second line of defense, leading to the Russians aligning the front line to the second line of defense, where the Ukrainians are now forced to hold on to. If not, the Russians will likely break through that line of defense and conduct a similar operation. What we're currently seeing is that beyond the second line of defense, there's hardly any fortifications within the city itself. Instead, they are situated around the city in the southern, western, and northern directions. This means that if the Russians go through the second line of defense of the Ukrainians in the east of Toretsk, there will be no fortified positions left within the city itself. Instead, the Ukrainians will have to rely on their high-rise buildings, their apartment complex areas, the industrial areas, the heights, and so on, the natural barriers to defend against the Russian advances, and they are naturally much weaker than the fortified positions, and the Ukrainians would take more casualties than they currently are in this section of the front line, especially because they will also need more soldiers to hold the lines than previously, because previously they can concentrate their forces in the heights and the fortified positions to defend from those directions, but now they'll be forced to spread out their forces all throughout the residential area, forest areas, and within the city itself, the apartment complex areas. Everywhere they need to concentrate their forces to prevent a Russian breakthrough, and this requires a lot more soldiers. This also means that more soldiers will be redirected from either the rear or other sections of the front line. And at the same time, we see in the north of Soledar, the Russians have advanced further in the northern direction of Robotina. The Russians have here managed to capture the final fortified positions of the Ukrainians north of Robotina and reach the outskirts of Pereshne. At the same time, we also see that the village of Fedorivka is very nearby, on the other side of the Bakhmutovka River. We see that the Russians have restarted operations by Selesnyansky. This could indicate a start of Russian operations in the direction of Pereshne, Fedorivka, Klishchiivka, and Homivka here in the western section of Soledar, where the Russians could start offensive operations in these directions of all of these villages in an attempt to expand the front line and start an offensive operation in the direction of Siversk in the north and to move further along the canal in the west. Recently, in the past few days, we have seen a severe intensification of the fighting all across the front, both in the Kupiansk section all the way to Robotina, and mostly in the Donetsk section of the front line, where Krasnohorivka is constantly being stormed by Russian armored vehicles and infantry. Krasnohorivka is being stormed through in the outskirts of the city. In the central part by the Pokrovsk section of the front line, we see non-stop advances by the Russians all across the front. In the Toretsk section of the front line, the Russians have aligned the front with the second line of defense ahead of the operation to take the second line of defense. And in north by Soledar, the front line has been intensified with the capture of Robotina, Spirne, Robotina, and it will continue into the next villages in this section of the front line. All of this indicates that the Russian offensive not just is not losing steam, but is actually gaining it. They're gaining momentum, and they're going to intensify the operations further over the next weeks. It is likely that the current situation is irreversible and that we're currently seeing the Ukrainians not think about anything other than preventing a collapse right now, as a collapse of one of these sections of the front could lead to a collapse of the others and a general collapse of the Ukrainian front. Therefore, we see that the Ukrainians are dedicated everything they have to establish and hold the current positions and prevent a Russian breakthrough, because a Russian capture of Toretsk in New York, Pokrovsk, Chasiv, Kupiansk, Liman, Soledar, all of these areas could significantly worsen the conditions for the Ukrainians on the front line and make it very difficult for the Ukrainians to continue their operations in this war. So we are nearing the end of this very long tale of the war in Ukraine, and this is most certainly the most important time in this war since the very first days of it. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon for additional content. Thank you all for watching, and have a great day.